You're going to accuse a chemical company with a barn scale? The company's lawyer said it loud enough for everyone in the county courthouse to hear. Two men in the front row laughed, but the old beekeeper sitting at the plaintiff's table, Elias Vance, didn't move. He only rested his hands on the worn, leather-bound ledger in front of him and waited in silence. 3 days later, that same lawyer wouldn't be able to look anyone in that room in the eye. Because with that scale everyone thought was worthless, Elias Vance had spent 19 years gathering proof of something no one knew about. And that proof was a single number. To understand how that scale ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back about a year. Elias was 68 years old and he lived alone on a 40-acre farm in the eastern part of Michigan's Thumb, a few miles outside Deckerville. His wife Ruth had died in the winter of 1971. After that, the farm had gone quiet, and all that was left was the bees, a few chickens, and work that never ended. He wasn't a rich man, but across 3 counties people knew 2 things about him. He always paid what he owed, and he never forgot anything that mattered. 40 hives wasn't a big operation. In the neighboring counties, commercial beekeepers ran 600, even 1,000 hives. But Elias's hives were well kept and strong, and by selling his honey at 50 cents and his wax for a few dollars, they gave him enough to get by on each year. It was a lonely man's life, but for Elias, it was a decent one. His father had taught him the scale. Otis Vance used to say, "A beekeeper looks at the field and guesses how his colony is doing. A good beekeeper weighs it." Otis was an old-fashioned man. He'd learned bees before the First World War, from his own father, not through lessons, but by watching, by holding the frames, by watching the smoke, by listening to the change in a hive's hum the way a doctor puts his ear to a chest. Otis had taught his son that a colony's weight speaks a language of its own. In spring, when the queen began to lay, the weight went up. During the nectar flow, it climbed fast. When winter came, it fell away slowly. But if a hive lost weight in a single day, with no visible reason, there was something wrong. Otis died in the summer of 1957. Elias was 49 then, and the evening he came back from his father's funeral, he lifted a hive onto the old livestock scale set on 2 wooden legs, read the weight, wrote the date in a ledger, and put a single number under it. It was always the same hive. Hive number 7, its number burned into the wood with a hot nail. After that, every evening, once the sun had gone down, he walked out to the beeyard with a gas lantern and weighed that hive. He couldn't quite explain to himself why he did it. It was just that he seemed to hear his father's voice telling him that to keep measuring was the same thing as to keep talking. The trouble started when Carl Brandt, the big farmer to the west, decided to try a new insecticide. Brandt wasn't a bad man. He was 40. He ran the biggest sugar beet and corn operation in the county, and he was a hard-working, respected man who knew his soil well. That summer, the aphids and the beet flies were bad, and a dealer in the neighboring county had recommended a new product to him, Pencap M. The brochure was impressive. The insecticide was sealed inside microscopic capsules, which made it safer for the man applying it than the old chemicals, and it stayed effective in the field longer. The dealer had told Brandt this was the modern way. Brandt had read the brochure, found it sensible, and arranged for an aerial spraying. In those years, there were still old single-wing crop dusters flying low over the skies of beet country. The one thing the brochure didn't say was that those capsules were exactly the size of a grain of pollen. The plane came one July morning. Elias heard it while he was drinking his coffee in the kitchen, that low, insistent drone of the engine in the distance, then its descent over the field. He stepped out onto the porch, shaded his eyes with his hand, and watched the plane pass back and forth over Brandt's beet field. The beeyard sat on the downwind edge of that field, so the distance between them was about half a mile. The spraying looked reasonable. Brant was on his own land, protecting his own crop. Elias didn't see anything strange that morning. His bees were flying as they always did, toward the direction the low-flying biplane had climbed away into the sky, out to the clover and the wildflowers there. But there was something a beekeeper should have known, and that morning no one did. The bees couldn't tell the poison apart. They'd mistake those capsules for pollen, pack them into the baskets on their hind legs, carry them back to the hive, and feed them straight into the mouths of the brood. And long after the chemical had lost its potency, those capsules stayed as poison in the hive's pollen cells for days. For the next 3 days, nothing happened. Then on the 4th morning, when Elias walked out to the beeyard, he heard the sound of the ground. A beeyard has a hum all its own, the sound of a healthy morning, low and steady, rising from 40 hives, spreading out over the meadow. That morning the sound was wrong. The soil in front of the landing boards was covered with dead and dying bees. Hundreds of them flipped onto their backs, legs trembling, wings unable to move. Elias knelt down. He took a handful of dead bees into his palm, held them up to the light, and looked at them for a long time. There was no sign of a fight on them, no sign of disease. Elias knew every form of death a beekeeper sees in 40 years, and this was none of them. He rose slowly, looked out toward the beet field to the west, then turned to the westernmost hive, number 7. When he weighed it that evening, the number was 4 pounds lower than the night before. It wasn't much, but it was a weight a hive should never lose in a single day. Elias wrote the number in the ledger, then stood in the dark for a while and said nothing. The deaths didn't stop. Every morning the pile of dead in front of the landing boards grew, and every evening hive number 7 got a little lighter. Elias knew now what was happening. He might not have known its name, but he could see the mechanism. The poison wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. His bees were carrying it home. On the 7th day he walked out to the beeyard and heard almost no hum at all. Most of the hives had emptied out or grown so weak that the queen had stopped laying. Out of 40 hives there were maybe 8 that could still stand. Elias worked the numbers in his head, and the numbers were merciless. Before winter had even set in, most of a year's income was gone. But it wasn't money on Elias's mind. What was on his mind was how he would prove to someone else why this had happened, because dead bees don't talk, and what a man sees on his own means nothing to anyone else. He filled a jar with dead bees, sealed the lid tight, and that evening he called his son David. David worked at a tool factory in Flint. He was 44, and like his father, he was a man of few words. He listened for a long while on the phone, then said just one thing. "Dad, how are you going to prove this wasn't your fault? The man sprayed his own field. He never meant to kill your bees." Elias looked out the kitchen window, out at the dark beeyard. "I don't know," he said. There was a silence. Then David asked, "How many hives are gone?" Elias paused a moment before he answered. "Almost all of them." On the other end of the line he heard David breathe. "Go to a lawyer tomorrow," David said, "before you do anything." Elias hung up the phone, and he didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table until dawn, 19 years of ledgers in front of him. 19 of them. Every number from every evening, all of it just as his father had taught him, without a single missing day. In the morning he drove into town, to the county seat, and walked into a lawyer's office. But the company that had done the spraying had a lawyer too, and that man had already gone over to Carl Brandt's side. Because while Elias sat at his kitchen table looking at his ledgers, something he didn't understand was taking shape. The other side had already built a story, and in that story, the guilty party wasn't the insecticide. It was a negligent old beekeeper. The whole burden of proof was about to come down on Elias's shoulders, and all he had was a jar full of dead bees and an old scale of the kind that weighs a sack of feed. How could a dead bee accuse a chemical company? What could a barn scale say in a courtroom? That morning, even Elias himself didn't fully know the answer to those questions. But somewhere in those 19 years of ledgers, there was a number he hadn't even noticed yet. And that single number would change everything. The lawyer in town, Walter Rees, listened to Elias patiently, but the look on his face wasn't encouraging. When Elias set the ledgers on the desk, Rees glanced at them, then scratched his head. "Elias," he said, "this is your own handwriting. A man writing 'the hive got lighter' in his own ledger doesn't prove in court what made that hive lighter. The other side can stand up and say, 'This man didn't take care of his hives. They caught a disease. They starved.' Your word against theirs. And behind them is a chemical company." Elias was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "What about the dead bees?" Rees sighed. "A dead bee is a dead bee. The bee in the jar won't tell you why it died. A laboratory has to say that." That was the sentence that stuck in Elias's mind. A laboratory. Until that moment, he'd been a man fighting alone. But for the first time, he thought that maybe he didn't have to fight this alone. He took the jar of dead bees to East Lansing, to the laboratory at the State Agricultural College. 2 counties over, a 3-hour drive in the truck. The entomologist there, a woman named Dr. Sarah Coyle, took the jar and asked what he was looking for. Elias said only, "What killed these bees?" When Coyle called days later, her voice had changed. In the bees' stomachs and in the pollen dust at the bottom of the jar, she'd found tiny plastic capsules, invisible to the naked eye, each one almost exactly the size of a grain of pollen. Inside them was methyl parathion. "Mr. Vance," Coyle said, "these bees didn't eat the poison somewhere out in the open. They mistook it for pollen, gathered it, carried it back to the hive. The only way to see this was under a microscope. No one can look at a dead bee and see this." As he held the phone, Elias looked out the kitchen window at the empty beeyard. Now he had a mechanism. But there was still a problem. The laboratory could say how the bees had died, but it couldn't say the poison had come from Carl Brandt's field. And this is exactly where the scale began to speak. Because Elias's ledger didn't just say, "The hive got lighter," it recorded the exact date of every day and the exact weight for that day, across 19 years, without a single missing day. Rees studied the ledgers a second time carefully now and noticed something. The hive's weight had started dropping exactly 3 days after the plane came. 3 days. That was precisely how long it takes for a bee to gather pollen and carry it back to the hive, for that pollen to be fed to the brood, and for the colony to begin collapsing. Rees looked into the county's agricultural records. In those years, every aerial spraying had to be reported to the commissioner's office along with its date. Brandt's spraying date was in the file. When they lined it up against the date the drop began in Elias's scale ledger, the 2 numbers sat right on top of each other. This was no longer one man's word. It was 3 separate records confirming one another. The laboratory said what the poison was, the commissioner's office said when the spraying was done, and the scale gave the 3-day bridge between that date and the deaths. But there was something even more important. In those years, there was a government program for beekeepers who lost their bees to a federally approved insecticide, passed in 1970, a program that partially compensated losses retroactively as far back as 1967. But it had one strict condition. The beekeeper had to prove that he'd taken reasonable precautions to protect his bees, and that he could document his loss. Most small beekeepers could never prove this because no one wrote down the weight of every hive every day. But Elias had. The 19 years of ledgers were exactly the kind of documentation that program asked for. A day-by-day record of when the loss happened and how fast. That habit his father had taught him, the one that had seemed so pointless, turned out to be the very key to this moment. When Otis Vance died, he left his son no fortune. He'd only said, "Keep weighing." And 19 years later, that sentence was worth enough to save a farm. When the day in court came, the company's lawyer still thought the scale was ridiculous. When he said, "You came with a scale?" the room laughed. But then Reese stood up and set 3 things on the table in order: the laboratory's report, the county's spraying record with its date, and Elias's ledger. He explained that the capsules were the size of pollen, that the bees had carried them, that the deaths had begun exactly 3 days after the spraying, and that the scale had documented those 3 days, day by day. Then he turned to the lawyer and asked one question. Did your client know this product contained capsules the size of pollen? Because that wasn't in the brochure. The room went quiet. The lawyer opened his mouth to say something, then closed it, because the answer was no. Neither Brandt nor the dealer had known it, and that was exactly the point. No one had acted in bad faith. It was just that no one had asked the right question. The dead bees hadn't spoken maybe, but that old scale that weighs a sack of feed had spoken in the end, clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. Carl Brandt wasn't a bad man, and the story didn't turn him into one. When he read the verdict, he was quiet for a long time, then said just one thing to Elias. "I read that brochure. I read it front to back. But I couldn't see something that wasn't there." After that day, Brandt never used that product on his fields again, and he was the first to tell the other farmers in the county not to use it either. Elias got his compensation, not the full worth of the hives and honey he'd lost, but enough to get through the winter and start again in the spring. The next spring, he built new colonies, settled the bees that came in packages into new hives, and on the first evening, once the sun had gone down, he lit the gas lantern and lifted hive number 7 onto the scale. He read the weight. He wrote the date. He put a single number under it. Nothing had changed. He carried on with his routine. Years later, when Elias was very old, his son David came out to the farm one evening and found his father in the beeyard again, that old ledger in his hand. The scale was still there, on the same 2 wooden legs. David watched his father for a long time, then asked, "Dad, there's nothing left for you to prove. Why are you still weighing?" Elias finished writing the number, closed the ledger, and looked at the light fading over the fields to the west. "I don't weigh for proof," he said. "I never weighed for proof. My father taught me that caring about something every day is a way of loving it. The scale just helps me remember." Today, those ledgers are still there. David kept them, and every number in them is the record of a man who, every evening for 19 years, when no one was watching, stayed faithful to something that mattered. Maybe there's someone like that in your life too. Someone who does a small thing every day that no one understands, without ever missing a day. Back then it may have seemed pointless to you, even stubborn. But more often than not, those quiet habits turn out to be the very things that hold us up years later, in the moment we need them most. If the stories of people like Elias Vance remind you of something, then the kind of stories we tell on this channel may be just right for you. If you'd like to keep remembering these quiet but steadfast lives together, you can subscribe.